Right, so welcome. This is the first conversation we're having with people that I know effectively, starting with the champion bloke, Dr. Paul Wood. He prefers to call himself Paul Wood. I think a lot of people know Paul, and maybe a lot of people don't know Paul. So I thought he's a great place to start our conversations. Just a absolute beast around mental fitness, around resilience. Just brought out a book called How to Escape from Prison. And it's a real account. I've actually just finished reading it in the last kind of 12 weeks, or 6 weeks. I kind of sent you a bit of a text to say what a great book. And so today I just wanted to spend a bit of time with Paul, and I'm hoping, the people listening will get a lot of benefit out of listening to you, or I know they will. I thought I'd kick off, Paul, just with how I met you. I thought sometimes it's good to go up memory lane. So, and what sparked is reading the book. I don't think I realised at the time when you were next door. So Paul at that stage had been working with Opera, and he was down in Wellington. We were in the Williston Street building at that stage. So I don't know where it was in your journey, but I remember walking over next door, and here's this guy. I like to talk, and Paul likes to talk, and shit, you're a hell of a funny, certainly a good character. You were talking stories about, I think it was gym work at that stage, and maybe the travels between Auckland and Wellington and how all that was coming together. And I wrote down here, I go, shit, it was just good to meet a guy who had, in HR circles, a lot of people know, but some people don't. It's a really female-dominated space. So, meeting someone like Paul, who is definitely a man's man in that regard, a lot of character, a lot of fun, a lot of polish. And I just remember walking out of this meeting or conversation laughing, and I walked back to our space just cracking up. I don't know if you kind of first remember the Williston Street building, or whether you were coming down from Auckland, or whether you'd moved at that stage.
Yeah, I was coming down from Auckland at that point, and I remember as well catching up with you because, of course, look, I come from a family of boys. I'm one of 4 brothers. So what I remember and what initially made me like you, so much to like, Troy, so much to like, but what initially made me like you is that you just met me and started giving me shit straight away. And for me, I took that as a form of endearment, of course, having come from a family of brothers. So that instantly made me like you. And I'm sure it was gym conversations or something equally knuckle dragging that we were discussing.
Yeah, correct. So I think at that stage we'd had one of the gentlemen who worked for me is called Fraser, and I think he had been through a course that you guys had run, and you might have been the instructor on that one on that day. So he spoke really highly of you, and it was interesting though, because whether it was in the week or within the month, that's when your newspaper article came out. And I remember reading this article one morning and thinking, shit, here's a bit of background I didn't know about this guy. So I don't know. I think that might be a good place to start. You are, you've just turned up to Wellington. You've just written a newspaper article. I know you talk about it in your book. But yeah, that started in my mind, Dr. Paul Wood, the business. So maybe not a lot of people think of you like that. We were just talking before, obviously it's around resilience, mental fitness, all the work you've done in that space. But maybe I'd just like to kick off with, Dr. Paul Wood, the business. How's it developed? How's it gone since writing the article and obviously leading up to writing the book?
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting place to start. For me anyway, in terms of my journey, my background's fairly widely known these days, or it's not a secret anyway. But actually, up until the point where that Dominion Post article came out, my background of imprisonment was not widely known at all. It was not something which was in the public domain to any great extent. And it was interesting because for me, I got out of prison. I was 29. I'd been in prison for 10 years, 10 months, from when I was 18 to when I was 29. I got out, and I was incredibly fortunate in the sense that I had this opportunity to go and work for this organization, Opera Consulting Group. The 2 managing directors, Dr. Paul Inglett and Dr. Sarah Burke, were people who had supported me through my study while I was still in prison, particularly Paul Inglett, who was a close family friend and who's been such a valuable mentor for me. But him and Sarah gave me that opportunity for employment when I was released. And it was a pretty funny situation, Troy, because of course, I'm such an unknown quantity. They knew that I had the intellectual capability and the work ethic to be successful, and the qualifications. I had gone through my undergraduate, my master's degree in prison at that point. I was 2 years into my doctorate by the time I was released. But I had never been a civilian. I'd spent my whole adult life in prison. So what they did initially is they kind of created work for me a little bit. Now, they would argue and say, no, that's not the case because, you know, they're very business-oriented people, but they kind of did. What they did is they gave me this contract working from home to update technical manuals for the psychometric assessments and that they're so well known for. And so I was working from home and I'd occasionally pop into the office, and it was for them to sort of get a bit more of a feel for, you know, whether I was going to be okay out of the confines of prison. And then what happened was that work dried up. So I just went, okay, no hassles, doing the PhD full time, spent a lot of time at the gym as well. You know, I was right into my exercise at that point, which is something that you naturally get into when you're in the prison environment, because the prison environment is the law of the jungle. And the more physically fit and capable you are, the more likely you are to be targeted by people, and the more likely you are to be able to successfully defend yourself if you're attacked. So there's really strong motivation for it in there. Then, of course, there's all the stuff I know about exercise now, which is the well-being component of it and just how effective it is for helping you manage stress and that. But really, that motivation for me had come from that predatory environment I'd inhabited in prison. And I just, you know, carried on the exercise as part of my routine on the way out there. And then they had a consulting role come up in Opera, and they let me know that was coming up. Dr. Inglet removed himself from the selection process there because he was the one who had bias towards me as a personal friend. I went through the application process. I came out the strongest applicant, you know, did all the psychometrics, did the interviews, all that sort of stuff. But as you'll know from the book, they were still a bit uncertain about bringing me on because they weren't certain about how I'd go in terms of client facing. And so what they did is they set up an extra hurdle for me in the selection process where they got me to come along and they got me to have a meeting with one of their clients who was also in the recruitment space, such as yourself, actually. And he was someone who had built his business and they had a strong relationship with him. And they knew that he called a spade so that he'd be good to get a steer from. So I came along to this meeting. Afterwards, Paul Inglet said to him, oh, what did you think of this guy? And he said, oh, you know, he was a bit of an egghead, pretty academic, not from the school of hard knocks like us, which was just the best possible feedback they could have gotten about me. That, you know, that just was not detected. So I got this job with them, and then it was actually about, I think it was about 5 or 6 years. It was about 5 years before my story became public knowledge, but it was about maybe 3 or 4 months after I was released that I was contacted by the Dominion Post, and they said, look, we want to run a story on you, a good news counterpoint to the normal doom and gloom we get from people coming out of prison. And I said to them, look, I appreciate that, but if you run a story right now, I haven't had enough time under my belt as a contributing tax-paying member of society to really be credible. You're going to have lots of people going, oh, well, this guy's just an educated criminal now. Not only that, I'd have to resign from Opera because they had contracts with corrections and the police. Now, I was never involved in delivering work for those clients. So that was something that was compartmentalized in terms of my role, you know, to avoid any sort of potential conflict of interest, you know, challenges there. But the fact that that would have been a political hot potato for them would have meant that the honourable and the right thing to do would be to resign. So I said, look, if you hold off, if you wait until I finish my PhD, I'll do the story with you. But if you don't, you know, you're on your own. I'm not going to do an interview or anything. And I was wildly optimistic, thinking it would take me a year to finish my PhD at that point. That's what I told them. So 5 years later, I finished my PhD, and they had held off that whole time. And that's when that story was getting ready to run. And I'd kind of reached a ceiling in terms of my career anyway at Opera, because this is the thing about consultancies in New Zealand is, you know, they're relatively small businesses. It's a small market. And so unless you're an owner operator, there's only a certain level that you can sort of really get to. And I had sort of gotten to that level, and I was wanting to go out and focus on what my real passion was, which was development. And those are the arms of the Opera business I had oriented towards and taken over, was the training and development arms. And I wanted to pursue that passion myself and just focus entirely on that. But also I wanted to remove any possibility of there being a negative impact on Opera for employing me. And I really didn't know what the outcome of that story would be in the paper. And, you know, I was counseled by some people not to do it. Don't trust the press, don't do it. But I thought, look, at the end of the day, the impact I can have on other people through doing that story is more beneficial and something that'll be more meaningful for me when I look back and measure my life than just carrying on with an easy career where I'm doing well and where I'm getting paid and all that stuff. because one of the things that was a real psychological barrier for me when I was in prison is that I had no examples of people who had gotten out of prison and really been accepted back into the community with offences as serious as mine. And so I used to sometimes wonder, you know, am I kind of wasting my time trying to change my life? Am I so just, you know, darkened and just tainted by this imprisonment and by my offending that I'm never going to be able to be accepted back into society? And so for me, being able to provide an example for people where other people in prison, other people who are in difficult places who are going, look, I feel a sense of shame around where I am and what I've done, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to get past this. Am I wasting my time trying? That they can point to me and go, here's someone who was convicted of murder, the most serious of offending, whose background is commonly known, yet who's still a contributing, tax-paying member of society, trying to do good in the world, you know, and who's accepted by people. I thought that is more important than me just having an easier career, an easier time of it. So I chose to do the story, contributed to it. And I'll tell you, one of the most interesting experiences there was contacting all of my key clients just before the paper came out to let them know, because as you know, there's nothing worse for clients than surprises. There's one thing people don't like, it's surprises. And so I crafted this email with the help of the senior management of Dr. Sarah Burke in particular. And in it, I had let people know around the article that was coming out, and also as well had provided Sarah's contact details so that if they were uncomfortable getting in contact with me or they had any concerns or anything, they could contact her. And you can imagine as I'm sort of hovering over the send button on that first email, I'm going, oh, God, you know, sent it out. Yeah, and you know, the initial response from people was just really positive, actually. And it was such a relief because I had spent all this time feeling like I had this sword of Damocles hanging over me. You know, like I used to be in client meetings sometimes, or even interacting with people like yourself, where I would have these positive interactions, these positive relationships, and with clients where I'd be delivering really good work for them, they'd be really happy with what was happening. And then I'd just have this thought, which was, I wonder how they would respond if they knew about my background. It just passed through my mind like this massive secret, this massive thing hanging over me that if people knew could radically change their interactions and their opinions of me. And so, to be honest, when that became more public knowledge, it was super liberating. It was like being liberated a second time, in the sense that I just no longer had this hanging over me. And you know, there are lots of people out there in the community who don't like me and who won't get past my background. And I fully accept that. That's all good. And people have legitimate reasons for that, particularly if they've experienced violent crime in any way or had people close to them who have anything like that. Completely understandable. They wouldn't get over that. But most people who I work with, and in fact, the only people who work with me in that development space, organizations and individuals, are people who believe you can grow and develop, you can learn, you can come back from mistakes, you can be better than you are. And people in that space, people who have that outlook on the world, are people who tend to see me as someone who not only knows about development and change and finding the path, the pursuit of excellence from an academic perspective, but because I've really experienced personal transformation and growth myself. I know what's involved there. And
I think,
so,
if I can just ask a question there, I remember exactly
please.
To that point, you know, we got you obviously to come and join a strategy session with us in 2017. You were joining Inside. We're kind of setting upon a 3-year journey. And, you know, one of the things that struck me in your conversation is obviously the honesty, and I'd heard you once before, and I'll talk about that as well later. But what I love about psychology and what I love about you is essentially how you fronted it with the audience that we had in front of you that day. You know, I don't know exactly your words, you'll know the script, but essentially it's along the lines of, some of you will have listened to this, but you know, you'll be in your gut arguing with yourself around, can I like this guy? Should I like this guy? Or why don't I like this guy? And you know, I think it's interesting when you understand psychology to the level you do, how you can put the audience to really start understanding their emotions. And I remember that really clearly thinking, because my wife was one, for example, who went, oh, I just walked away, not sure. And I'm like, because I'd had 2 or 3 interactions with you, I went, well, I don't know, you know, I understand what you're saying, but I love how you front it and how that there is psychology just to understand it. You know, feelings are real, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, and it's such an interesting one as well. Like one of the things I'm really clear about as well when I talk is my culpability in terms of my offending. Because what had happened was there was basically a dispute with a person who was dealing with drugs at the time where they attempted to attack me, and I went way beyond what was required in terms of self-defense and ended up ending their life. And it's really easy for people when they know the background of the person who was my victim to sort of minimize my offending and to sort of go, oh no, well, they weren't a good person. Oh, Paul, he seems so nice. Because what we do is we have this confirmation bias. If we know someone already and we like them, we're far more likely to make up excuses and minimize their behavior to maintain that positive image of them. But the reality is I was someone who was not a positive person. I made every choice to put myself into that situation. I made every choice that ended their life unnecessarily and earned myself my place in the New Zealand prison system. And in fact, if you're dismissive of that, or if you minimize or reduce the reality of that, it's kind of like you're actually minimizing and reducing our capacity for change and growth as human beings, because you're trying to close the gap between who I am now and who I was then in your own mind. But the reality is it was a massive gap, a massive gap. I was not someone doing anything positive in the world whatsoever. Whereas these days, I really try to be. I really try to balance that ledger. And it's important for people that I try and communicate that to them, that culpability, but also that it's okay to have different emotional experiences around this in terms of how you process this. It's a challenging one though, Troy, because, I like to be liked.
Yeah.
We all do to some extent. So sharing information with people where you just know there's going to be a percentage of the people in the audience who are not going to like you is a struggle. I'm not sure if I mentioned this to you before, but of course, I get the occasional sort of email and that from people who are pretty clear about their dislike of me. But I remember once when I was getting ready to present and go and talk at a conference, and there were hundreds of people there, and I was waiting up against the back, and I was talking after a break, so there were people coming in a bit late, and a group of people sort of came in a little bit late, and they walked past me, and they didn't know who I was, and one of the women said to one of the guys, "Where should we sit?" And the guy went, "Not too close, he's a killer." And I was like, oh, because you want to feel buoyant before you get up, eh? But, again, so that's just like a reality check in terms of how people who don't know you do view and perceive that sometimes. And like I said, man, that's all good. People are entitled to their views and opinions. And my background has earned me, a lot of dislike and skepticism from people who perhaps haven't been exposed to I suppose, redemption or rehabilitation before. But yeah, it's challenging when you like to be liked.
Yeah, I think, I suppose linking back to, what I, apart from the character, I say that to your characterism. I like people who are good fun, who can talk and have a joke and take a joke. So that draws me in. I think the real second part, I think what you study draws me in, given what I've done, my role in recruitment. I'm a massive fan of, I suppose, candidates transitioning and doing that really well. And I guess there's a place for a job and job hunting, but I think where I really like your thinking and where I think the conversation starts with you, at least relating to myself in recruitment, is that, it doesn't start at applying for a job. We've got to start a lot earlier, starting with ourselves, starting with our aspirations, starting with our wish for ourselves, our want for the future for ourselves. And to your point, I go, and I think I spoke to you about this, we engaged you to help us with a program we were developing for New Zealand Defence Force in and around their transition services. And, one of the things, I think that blew that group away was understanding that transition can be as big as it sounds like when they think about your transition. But it's funny, when I hear your story, I can break that down quite quickly and really apply it to every candidate that comes and sees me. At the end of the day, if you've been sitting in an organisation for 10 years or sitting in a role for 10 years, you need to transition. Whether you have just turned 30 or just turned 40, you need to transition. There are a whole lot of moments in your life, and I say that going, I think if you can just talk us through, some of the psychology of transition, but also the work you do with transition, because I know you work not only with corporates, individuals, but you're working with professional sports people. Just take us through some of that, because I'm a massive fan of that first starting point being, you probably yourself and your own wish for yourself, perhaps.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, right? Like the idea of transition in that respect. And I've loved doing that work with the Defence Force through you and otherwise with the Army and the Navy, because, I grew up expecting I would join the infantry at 18. And if I was living the dream, get into the SAS. That's what I grew up wanting to do with my life. And so those opportunities have been really cool. And it's an environment I relate to because, of course, there's a lot of bloody similarity between prison and the Defence Force. You're talking about predominantly male, a lot of ultra masculine attitudes and ideas which aren't necessarily healthy. You're also talking about a lot of routine, a lot of structure, a lot of hierarchy, all of that sort of stuff. Also, as well, one thing I'd say is with the rugby, the work I've done there in transition, it's an interesting one because it's exactly, that same environment. If you've been in the same environment for a long period of time, you've developed ideas around what is it that gets me seen and valued? What is it that gives me my sense of worth, my sense of contribution, my sense of belonging, and how I operate? And as people, we just massively underestimate the impact of our situation on us and our environment. And so we don't realize just what's going to be involved in terms of transitioning out. And I think one of the big things that I've learned, which is really crucial, is that when it comes to transition of any type, that we don't focus on what are called outcome goals, but we focus on what's called identity goals. So here's the difference, right? Like an outcome goal is, well, I want to do this. I want to have a certain amount of money. I want to get this qualification. I want to work in this type of industry. I want to get this type of job, this type of car. It's something tangible. It's like a tangible outcome you can get. But if you really want to be effective in terms of transition, you want to be focusing on identity goals, which is about growing into the person you want to be. Because the difference between those is, think about this, like I'm in a job, I've created a job for myself now and a business for myself now that I did not know existed when I started on my personal path of change and growth. But because of the things that really mattered to me in terms of my transition were about growing into the type of person I wanted to be, that's meant that I'm far more prepared to adapt and to be effective and functional and happy in all sorts of different environments. Whereas if I had all of my sort of like goals fixated on one particular outcome objective, like for example, originally when I started studying, it was around the area of psychology known as individual differences, how we differ in terms of personality, emotional intelligence, resilience, stuff like that. But it was very much geared towards measuring those things, psychometrics. And if everything that I did had just been focused on achieving the qualifications in that area, then I wouldn't have been prepared to really sort of transition and grow into finding my true passion and calling in the way I have. And I think that's an important idea, that transition isn't about achieving some objective outcome thing here. It's about growing into the person you want to be, which will prepare you to be more effective in all sorts of situations. So it's focusing on the inward rather than the outward. Does that make sense, Troy?
Yeah, no, completely does. And I heard you've been speaking about it on a couple of recent updates you've done, to get in touch with you around these values, or some kind of self-evaluation. And I'm very, again, it doesn't typically come into the recruitment process, but I'm very big at trying to move, just with the groups we work with, specialists and leaders, and executive contracting, you're trying to get them to think about 5 years away and 10 years away and engage with your partner and engage with your family. But you've got to start, we try and get them to start with the values conversation, intrinsic, extrinsic, lifestyle values. If we can get those three elements, because I think the confusion when I'm talking to candidates, hey, could you just tell me what's important to you, what your values are? Without a framework, that's a nightmare of a question. It's a terrifying question to try and go home and work out. So I've certainly found, I'd encourage anyone listening to, to reach out to you to say, what does that values assessment look like and how do you do it? Because without the framework, it's a nightmare to go, I want to be a good person. Hopefully we all do.
100%.
But something is more burning than something else. So I'm with you. I really love the value statement. And I love those, I suppose we think about career conversations, we start thinking about, it's a bit cliche, but if you had all the money in the world, what would you be doing in 5 years' time, or where would you spend your time today? I love people thinking about what they could do, rather than what they can't do or the situation they're stuck in today. So I suppose from you, and I hate the word tips, but if you were telling or instructing someone on, hey, Paul, I just need to transition. I know what I'm doing today is not what I want to be doing in the future. Where do you start, and what are the 2 or 3 conversations they should be having with themselves, or what are the tools they need? Do you think?
Yeah, and look, again, I think values is an important one here. I think if you're clear about what your values are, and if you know your strengths, then what you can do is you can help narrow down the types of industries, organizations, and workplace cultures that will actually have you hitting your A game. And I think that's a challenge for people, is that they have these ideas around what they should place value on in terms of employment. But actually, if you really want to be somewhere where you'll thrive, where you'll hit your A game, where you'll want to be there, then it needs to be somewhere that allows you to play to your strengths, is in line with your values, helps you live your values, and makes you feel that you're doing something that matters. And that's tied in with values and purpose and passion as well. And if you're really lucky, there'll be a need for you too. If you can tie those 3 things together, going, well, what are my values, what are my strengths, and what are the needs in the market? You're living the dream, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is one of the things as well that we often don't do well in terms of recruitment, but also in terms of our pursuit of employment, is we don't think about the signature experience of the organizations we're considering, or the fit with the signature experience of the people we're looking at recruiting. Let me give you an example, right? You can be a computer programmer who has the technical skills to effectively program at a high level, but the signature experience, what it's like to work somewhere, might be very different between, say, Google and IBM. You might be doing exactly the same job on a surface level, right, in terms of, the day-to-day sort of programming requirements. But in terms of values alignment, in terms of the actual experience of being there, that's stuff that you really want to think about. But as you said, it's so hard for people. If they haven't given this any thought, then they just kind of only learn through actually putting themselves into these situations, rather than being able to be more strategic around where they focus their energy and attention and interest. And there's lots of simple stuff you can do. You mentioned for people to get in touch. I mean, look, if people want to get in touch, they just get in touch via my website, drpaulwood.com. Just say that you're after the values exercise, and I'll send you one that you can just do for free. Because again, if you don't have a scaffold, a structure, a framework, it can be really hard to pin that stuff down unless you've done work in this space. I think for someone like us who has done a lot of work in the space, you can lose sight of that fact, that most people actually aren't spending time navel gazing around this. And as a result of that it's a lot harder for them to articulate that. But if you can go in and you can go, look, I'm someone who really believes in this, this, and this. These are the things that are important to me. This is what I'm good at. What it will help you do is it'll help you actually narrow down what might be something which has the most meaning for you, the most value, the most impact in your life, rather than just going, I need a job.
Yeah.
So I think that's terrible. And I think that's something people often lose sight of in recruitment, right? When they're dealing with recruiters such as yourselves, is that you are doing someone a disservice to put them into a role where they're not going to be happy and they're not going to flourish. It's not about, just getting the sort of the bum on the seat and having that done and that taken care of if they can perform the technical requirements. If you're putting someone into a situation where they're not going to be well suited, they're not going to thrive, they're not going to flourish, you're not doing them any favors.
No,
life is way too short to be in a role that you're not happy with, eh?
Yeah. No, I think that's it. I guess there's an element of nervousness at the moment when I think about how many people will transition, whether they're wishing to or whether they're just, forced to do in the current environment. And to your point, I think there's a real issue between the needs must and being actually, I've still got to put food on the table or I've still got to pay the rent. But what I'd like, I suppose I'll take this moment just because it fits with this part of the conversation, that you can still take a breath and do what you're talking about. And I love those 3 elements, because there are still things needs must, I have to do this today, but my plan says I'm going to start heading in this direction from this point in time. And to your point, here's my values, here's my purpose, here's what I'm good at, here's what I'm best at, or here's what I love. So one of the things we talk to clients, but it's interesting when I think about, to your point, candidates, very few of them, and I don't know what the percentages would be, but let's say it's 20% of candidates know themselves so well that they could identify the organisation, again, its values, its purpose, its skills, so that they can make that, alignment. And And again,
Yeah.
once you're having that conversation with someone who might have resigned or might have been forced out of position, 4 weeks is a rush to, to kind of get all of this mass work done and get to market and get the new job. But, I think...
And that's where you come in though, right, Troy? Like if I'm a candidate, if I know myself, then you know the market and you know where I might be suited to. Is that knowing yourself? But I think an interesting sort of piece to think about here too is just to go back to that transition of my experience of that too, is if you're working on that stuff, if you're working on growing into being the person who you want to be, and you have greater clarity around who that is, what you're good at, what's important to you, then it's so much easier to identify and pursue the opportunities that are going to make the biggest difference for you. Like, for example, I never could have imagined my life being as my life is now. I couldn't have forward planned this. It's like people often talk about the 5-year plans and the 10-year plans, and that's great stuff if that's your thing. But for me, 5 years from now, who knows what roles are going to exist and what roles aren't going to exist. So if you're picking it all on those sort of like outcome goals of going, well, I'm going to be here, I'm going to be able to be this or that, then you actually miss the opportunity to adapt and pursue opportunities that arise in the same way that you can if you're just more working on growing into being, that version of yourself you most want to be. But another thing I'd say as well, Troy, that I think based on my understanding of the research and what really matters is that, knowing your values and strengths, that's great as sort of the individual. But as organizations, I often think, we don't have a clear idea around what are the ingredients that we actually want from candidates that are going to make them far more successful outside of looking at, what university they went to or all of this sort of stuff that we can get hung up on. And this is something that you and I had a conversation about previously. And it's the outcome of some really great research that was done by Hogan International, who are an organization, like Bob Hogan is just one of the leaders in organizational psychology, workplace psychology internationally. And they looked at a whole heap. We're talking thousands and thousands of data points around what were the characteristics and attributes that led to career success and promotion. And I would argue that these things lead to life success, but it just so happens the research occurred in the workplace. And it basically came down to 3 things. And I like to remember these with the acronym of RAW, like raw meat, R-A-W. The raw ingredients that will have you successful in any areas of your life. And the R is, are you rewarding to deal with? So when I interact with you, do I walk away going, I would happily work with that person and interact with that person again? Or are you one of these people who people interact with you and they go, I will do everything I can to avoid having to interact with that person again? And we both know them, right? There are lots of people out there like that whose poor emotional management means that they just contaminate others with their stress and their bad moods and the rest of it. And it's not about perfection. We can all have that tendency. Sometimes I carry around a dark cloud sometimes on my bad days. But in general, are you rewarding to deal with? That's the R. The A is, do you have the ability? Do you have the ability to learn what's required of you to be successful in a particular role? And there are a couple of things there. You can talk about raw intellectual horsepower. And, that's the sort of stuff I used to look at as part of my master's and PhD when I worked for companies like Opera, where you're testing, you're going, where are people relative to others in terms of this just raw problem solving ability, the ability to pick up and learn and understand new information. So you got that part of it, the horsepower. But there's a whole other big piece as well, which comes in there, right? Which is the interest in the area. Have you ever tried to learn something you're interested in versus something you're not, Troy?
Yeah.
Your intellectual horsepower hasn't changed there, but boy, your ability to retain information and focus and the rest of it has. So there's that whole bit is, do I have the horsepower, but do I also have the interest in order to really be learning what's required of me to be successful in this role? So that's the A, the ability. And then the W is the willingness to do the work, the willingness to do the mahi.
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting one, eh? That's a really interesting one. So I've done a lot of work with people in elite areas, and I've had a lot of conversation with people in elite areas, and I find it interesting. So, All Blacks, for example, or people who have been in the SAS, that sort of stuff. And there is a level of work ethic that is required to be an All Black or to be in the Special Forces or to be in any other area where you're elite, which is unusual. And you could argue that it's actually dysfunctional if it's something which is applied in the same area lifelong. I want you to think about that, right? So think about this, like an All Black career or most Special Forces careers, they're of a certain period of time. They tend to be associated with a younger part of your life as an adult, where you can just devote all of your energy towards this. But actually, I would argue if you're still doing that same thing at 50, there's going to be costs associated with that in terms of other areas of your life, like your marriage, if you have one, your kids, that sort of stuff. But really, you know, it's like lots of people say, your level of success is determined by your ability to sacrifice other areas of your life. And that willingness to do the work is an important component in terms of career trajectory, success, progression. And I would say as a life success factor, it's about the willingness to do the work in any area that matters to you.
Yeah.
Like I said, this career component is a big one. But for me, look, you're in a similar situation to me. You know, you've got young kids, you know, you're married. For me, I'm not prepared. I'm not willing to do the work required to maximize the opportunity for my business to grow because of the cost that would have on my personal life that I place more value on. And, you know, I'm in my 40s, you know, my business is in a really good place. So I'm happy with that. Whereas say, you know, in my earlier 30s and my late 20s, and I can't talk to earlier 20s because I was in prison still, but that part of my life, I was far more prepared to sacrifice and show that willingness to do the work to succeed in my career than I am now because I place value on other areas. But that, are you rewarding to deal with? Do you have the ability to learn what's required of you? And do you have the willingness to do the work? Those are the things that organizations want to be looking for, because if you find people with those ingredients, they will thrive and excel in any area you put them.
Yeah, no,
they really will.
I think they're awesome points. I think, you know, I think about the many organizations and we see a lot of the HR teams, recruitment teams, talent teams, you know, really doing this focus around employee value proposition. And there's probably that real hard area where they have reality of their organizational values, reality of their leaders, reality of their leadership, versus what they need to sell to attract candidates and talent. And that's certainly, I think, where, you know, that to your point around recruitment or just speaking to people within the industry, within that organization, around the culture in different places, the values of different places. And I say that going, you know, one of the biggest things in transition outside of everything you've just discussed is really getting people to connect with their networks, you know, and learn and speak to a whole lot of variety of people to understand that one scenario or one piece of information isn't fact, or one piece of gossip shouldn't be taken as literal. You know, you've got to investigate a whole lot of scenarios. And I think that's one thing candidates should rely on their recruitment company for, or should rely on some independent individuals, you know, to get that, because there is sometimes a difference between what the employer is trying to sell as in regard to their story versus what the reality looks like. And that's pretty tough to put up with sometimes.
Yeah, 100%. And hey, just to close the loop on that sort of comparison with All Blacks and Special Forces and that, I think this is one of the areas that some organizations have actually misunderstood this, where they expect people to have the same willingness as an All Black or a Special Forces operative in terms of their work ethic. And I just don't think that's realistic in terms of longer spanning careers. So, you know, if you're working in central agencies or something like that, and you want to become like the top specialist in terms of policy, stuff like that, you know, that's not the same career trajectory as an All Black or a Special Forces operative, which is for a really short period of time where you're just chucking everything at it. And I think the recognition of that and going, actually, we don't expect people, we don't want people to be putting the same kind of energy into their long-term career as we would expect from them as an All Black, you know, it is important to recognize.
Yeah.
Because it is a longer game in those careers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you spoke to this. If it wasn't you, it definitely came through. I'm thinking about it.
I'll take credit if it was good, Troy.
Yeah. Well, I think I just talked to that. I go, we essentially put an internal culture brand. Well, I called it an internal culture brand. I don't know what it's called, but we talked about number one you, number one team, number one inside. But everything came back to being, you've got to be the number one version of yourself. And everyone's got, to your point, a different set of willingness and different set of just areas and potential in their life or issues they're dealing with in their life at any point in time. So you know, I think the best thing we took, well, one of the things we took away is if everyone is the best version of themselves, we're easily going to get the best team, and we'll easily, from our point of view, get the best insight. But as soon as you start to try and robotically take high performance value one and make everyone perform to that, then, you know, you get a whole lot of conflicts, you're getting a whole lot of internal battles. And, you know, I think the moment I got away from that everyone had to be defined by one set of high performance criteria, you know, the business changed. I'm sure that came from that session. It was really good. I absolutely wholeheartedly believe in number one you, and that number one you is individually different, sitting under a big platform of values, sitting under a big platform of purpose. This is what we stand for. This is what we do. So you haven't got a whole lot of people running a million different directions, but you know, you are allowing for that individual to be themselves and be the best version of themselves. So I love it.
Yeah, and look, that's the ultimate in terms of the really benefiting and leveraging the advantages of diversity and inclusion in terms of, look, different people have different levels of bandwidth, capacity, interests and drivers. But, you know, it is like the All Blacks saying, better human beings make better All Blacks. You know, better people make better employees. And if you're allowing people, if you're giving them permission to go, hey, look, I want you to try and be a better version of yourself. Not for us, but for you. And as a side benefit of that, we will get better from you. You know, we'll have a better culture, all the rest of it. But making sure that people are squared away and allowing for those individual differences, I think is crucial. But it's a challenging one, particularly if you're someone who is a driven individual yourself, right? One of the things you often see from people in senior leadership positions in particular, or owner operators, is this: everyone should have the same work ethic as I have. Everyone should have the same willingness to commit, to do what's required, to do the hours and the rest of it. And that's just not realistic. You know, not everyone becomes an All Black. Not everyone has that same drive and that same sort of perspective as those who make it into senior leadership and stay in those areas. So it's really unrealistic to have that expectation of others. And the second you drop that expectation, you're more likely to create an environment where people can actually be higher performing and more effective for you. I mean, it's the same deal. And this is why I love the physical component that both you and I are interested in, because there's so many parallels that you can take from that. It's the same deal. You know, we might be able to run a marathon. You know, you can do a triathlon, that sort of stuff. I can't swim, so that might be a struggle. But you wouldn't expect everyone else to be keeping up with you on a training run, right? You wouldn't expect everyone else to be at the same level, and you accept that. You accept that not everyone's prepared to put in that effort required. And so you would adapt accordingly if you're out doing exercise with people, and you have to do the same in terms of your workplace performance. And hey, just one of the things I want to say that I've personally found inspiring about watching you compete, and I know that's not a sentence you've heard very often. I'm not going to say it's pretty. I'm not going to say it's graceful, but I'll tell you what, when I watched your boy join you for the last bit of that run on the triathlon, I was like, that's what I want for my kids. You know, that's something that's inspiring and aspirational for me in terms of my kids, you know, as well. Seeing their dad, and they will definitely see their mum, as we've discussed before, out there crushing it. But the value of that and the lessons you get from that around work ethic, but also as well, that, you know, it's hard. Things that are really worthwhile aren't easy, and they're not supposed to be. I think this is one of the challenges with transition too, just to return to that closed loop on that, Troy, is that we get so used to being in the space we're in, we forget how much learning went on to reach the level of competence that we're at.
Yeah.
And so we start to transition, then all of a sudden we're out of this comfort zone and we're going, oh no, I don't really know how things work. I don't know what success looks like. I don't know what's required of me. And we think that's indicative of us being incompetent, or there being some problem with us, because we've forgotten about all the work and all the experience that went into getting us into our comfort zone in that previous environment. So I think that's a key one as well around that successful transition, is that going, it's supposed to take a lot more energy from me. I'm supposed to need to concentrate a lot more, to focus a lot more, and to find it more stressful as part of that transition. But through time and experience, it will become easy again for me as I just get more of that sort of the muscle memory equivalent. It takes less of that load. So anyway, I think that's important to keep in mind too, right?
Yeah, I think talking to your point around events, it's interesting learning for me. I get really anxious about events, and I that hasn't dissipated, which I kind of go, geez, the muscle memory at one point should kick in, but ultimately it doesn't. So, you know, one of the things I've learned is, you know, I really love training. I do it because it's good for my well-being. I'm certainly of the ethos, you know, healthy body, healthy mind, and it plays, you know, a big part for me. And one of the things I was willing to do is I'm willing to train and I'm willing to go to events provided my family can come. I don't need to cross a finish line just for the sake of me finishing it. It's funny, whereas other people go, they need their finish line, but to your point, to each individual is their own. And yeah, I really love having the kids there. I love having the family there. I really enjoyed seeing you know, you there. When your kids are younger like yours are, you know, you've got to push them over the line. You've got to carry them over the jumps. But mate, they'll love it. You know, getting into whatever you get into, who cares whether they follow your path? You just want them to be passionate.
Yeah,
it's really
100%. I've got to say, I did a run with our 5-year-old yesterday. He loves runs because he sees mum and dad all the time. But I must admit that did involve a section of me piggybacking him for that run as well. But, you know, as long as they're doing it and having that good time, and I think that idea that, you know, working hard is how you achieve things is crucial. But I just want to go back to your point as well about that anxiety not reducing. This is something we know from the psychology and research, which is really interesting, is often a lot of the time we think if we do things which are hard and make us a little bit anxious, then through repeatedly doing them, we won't become anxious anymore. Whereas actually what we know for a lot of people, that's not true. But what you'll do is instead of not being anxious anymore, you'll build your personal courage to an extent where it's easier to just do it.
Yeah.
To feel the anxiety and to just do it. Because you know you've been here before, you know what's involved. Even though it's hard, even though emotionally there's distress, you build that courage and that confidence to go, I got this. It's one of the interesting things in sports psychology where they focus heavily on mental toughness, which is the ability to remain effective in the heat of the moment. Is a big part of that is feeling confident. And that's not confident like walking around going, yeah, that's confident being able to go, I've been here before. I know that even though I'm having these feelings, it's going to be okay. I'm going to be okay. So actually that just stepping into it and not thinking that anxiety or worry or any of that distress is problematic for you. It's not. That's your body sending you signals that you're about to take on some kind of challenge. And that's cool. That's stuff you want to embrace, not stuff you want to avoid. And that's how you build that courage. You build that confidence.
Oh, I totally agree, and I think that's where you know, one of my missions. I think we need to get people like you out there talking to, you know, having people hear that, because I think there's a lot of people could do a lot more with their lives, knowing that anxiety exists, or knowing that, you know, you need a bit of courage, or you need 10,000 hours, whatever it is. But you know, persistence is still really important. So no, I'm 100% on board.
Yeah, and I think that's a key one, just to sort of like, I suppose, getting ready to wrap, because I think this is a great idea, Troy. It's just this idea that you actually want to focus on building your courage. One of my favorite quotes is from Mark Twain. Mark Twain had so many good quotes, but one of my favorite ones from him is, courage is not the absence of fear, but the management of fear. And I want you to think about that. You don't demonstrate courage unless you're feeling fear and anxiety and worry. You know, you're just proceeding. But the cool thing about courage is it's like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets, the easier it is to use. And I think one of the things that we really do a disservice to our young people with today is by really promoting this idea of focusing on being confident, when actually confidence is the byproduct that you get from having the courage to take action when you don't feel confident. If you demonstrate that courage, if you manage that fear and you take action even though you don't feel confident, that's how you get confidence.
Yeah.
Not by waiting till you feel confident. If you're waiting till you feel confident, you're going to be on the sidelines forever. And the cool thing about focusing on courage is something that is more in your control than confidence. Yes. Because courage is something that you demonstrate every time you just choose to do what's hard rather than what's easy, to do what's right rather than what's easy. And that can be in really small ways on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't have to be the big stuff. Whereas confidence, because it's an emotional byproduct of demonstrating courage, it's less in your control. So focus on your courage. Don't worry about your confidence. That'll just come from building that courage muscle.
Oh, I love it. I love it, Paul. Hey, I am going to call it to an end, but I reckon it's a perfect end, because right now, you know, if I can think about, you know, some closing words for candidates, for clients, that would be it. Right now, you know, it's courage, not confidence. It's really hard to be confident when there's so much uncertainty. But having courage or being ready to brace some of that anxiety and step forward, I think, certainly we all need to encourage and push people to the position where they can. Pushing might be the wrong words, but I'm out there talking to a lot of people, just wanting to encourage them, wanting to just see that there's a bright light somewhere. It's not everywhere, but there is a bright light. Is there any just closing words for you if you're sitting there, a candidate, you're an owner manager, going, what is it that I need to really focus on for the next whatever period of time? It may not be time bound, but what's your closing words around, transition and courage and just the state of things as with COVID today?
Well, I think the main thing to do and to be aware of is that the additional challenge, the additional stress of the period we're in right now is completely normal. Anything that you're experiencing in terms of increased worry, increased sort of need for a sense of certainty, all that, they're all normal reactions to abnormal circumstances. So I think not judging ourselves and trying to operate according to, business as usual is quite important at this point. And that may be being able to make space for and allow some of that additional worry and some of that additional distress, not trying to avoid it, not trying to repress it, not trying to say that you should feel it or anything like that, but just making space for it and going, hey, this is a normal reaction to abnormal circumstances. However, there's going to be an end point to the situation that's going on now. We can't be certain of when that will be. So what we need to do is we need to just focus on what's important right now. What can we do right now that'll put us in the best position possible whenever that end point comes?
Love it. Mate, thank you very much for giving up your time.
Oh, such a pleasure.
We'll be back in touch.
Right, take care.
Dr. Paul.